So today we're going to embark on this great challenge to get through as much of the Middle Ages as possible. And I don't know if we'll get through all of them. Maybe we'll get to the Middle Ages, and I don't know if we'll get to the High Middle Ages, but it was a fruitful time in a lot of ways, but there was ups and downs as every time
So there are good
goes.
things about Middle Age?
There are good things about Middle Age, yeah.
Been there, done that.
And then there's Then we get to the sunset years or the golden ages. I had a colleague from a long time ago who was retired, and he told me that the golden ages were not very golden. He says they were more like the rusty ages. So.
Were the Dark Ages then before the 5th century? Is that what's considered? They used
No, the Dark Ages are wrapped up in this
Okay, so it's like
period of
very
time.
hard.
Depends on where you are. Yeah. Because this begins to develop in the Middle Ages as scholasticism, and that begins to shape a culture, and that's what moves to dispel all of that. So the Middle Ages picks up right after Augustine and the first church council, roughly, a century and a half after the first council there, where they began to think this is what it means to really know God. This is who God is. This is what we understand to be true about God. And one of the things that the confession helps us to understand is that at that time, they needed to have clarity about what it was that what they were striving for in their understanding. They needed to have some sense of cohesive thought as a foundation for where do we grow from here in our knowledge of God. Because as you'll recall, prior to that time, there was just a host of different opinions about what it meant to know God and follow God, and who was Jesus, and what did it matter. And what we saw is that what you believe about Jesus makes a difference in how he mattered in history. And that's a key point that people began to say, yeah, we really need to pay attention to this. And so this council that Constantine called together was helpful for the church to really begin to think deeply about what it is that defines what we believe. What is the truth as we understand it and know? And that actually kind of began to set a pattern in the church's thought that periodically, and so we're rushing way through the Reformation here, but periodically the church finds it necessary to, in a historical moment, to come together and make a decision about what it is that we truly believe. In other words, what we will die for, and so usually those times are in times of great conflict and persecution. The church thinks about, well, do I want to die on this hill or not? And so there can be some concession, or in times of great doctrinal confusion, where there's been a great deal of heresy that takes hold, or just in terms of cultural adaptation, when the culture has become somewhat overwhelming and pervasive, and it begins to influence the thought of the church, then the church has to come together to think about, well, what is it, who is it that we really are, and what does it mean going forward? And so this is where the confessions come in over the period of time, is the church's self-understanding at a particular moment in time. So those confessions are influenced by that time. And when we read the confessions now, we sometimes don't understand why they were so, why are they so dogmatic about this particular? Well, it's because at the time that was an important point. It's kind of tempered a bit in time. Like, for instance, if you read the Westminster Confession, the original one, I mean, it's like the Catholic Church is the worst thing that ever happened on the face of the earth, and the Pope is the Antichrist, and anyone who believes it is going to hell and burned forever, and God bless it, you know. And it's like, wow, that's harsh, you know. That's not very loving. And you read it now, and it's kind of like, I can't believe that they thought that. But at the time, that was, you know, it was really hot stuff, because the Catholic Church was not then what it is now. Same with the Reformation. When we get to the Reformation, and a lot of things that Luther, you know, thought was important in the Reformation, and that the church really, you know, reacted to at that time, are things that the Catholic Church now embraces, you know, because they've come around. Their thought has changed, and so forth. So Luther would probably not be, you know, quite, he might be the crazy uncle you invite to Thanksgiving in their collective kind of history, but he wouldn't be the heretic we want to burn at the stake anymore. And so as thought changes and culture it seeps in, the church has to sometimes sit together and say, who is it that we are, and what does that mean going forward? For instance, like the Barmen Declaration was a really important one recent. When you're talking about church history, okay, recent is anything in the past 300 to 400 years, okay, because we're talking about 2,000 years of history. So recent is a relative term. So the Barmen Declaration in the middle of the 20th century early in the 20th century, developed in Germany as a reaction to Hitler and Nazism and their takeover of the church and so forth. So the confessing church had to get together and say, this is who we are, not that. And it was a pretty brave thing for them to do in the face of the persecution that they were experiencing and facing in making that kind of a statement. But they felt compelled to draw the difference between us and them. And it wasn't them saying them are bad. It wasn't the us saying them are bad. They were saying, this is just who we are. And we encourage you to be part of who we are rather than what is out there. So it wasn't always like that. In the Middle Ages was a time when this kind of jockeying between us and them really got started, because they were drawing the line between what was true faith and what was not. And that's an important distinction. I mean, it just can't be Jesus is whoever you want him to be. It just can't be that way. And there are people today who want to make Jesus into something different than who Jesus was. And it's kind of like, well, if we can all just agree on this, we can all get along. And it's like, well, but, you know, that's not our call. You know, we can't make that determination and so forth. So the Middle Ages becomes a time of formation, of understanding who it is that we are. And so these themes are dominant during this time. So the rise of monasticism, scholasticism, and the papacy are the important themes that carry culture and help develop culture during this period of time. We talked a little bit last week about Anthony of the Desert. That was kind of the beginning of the monastic movement, and it was very influential, but it was in their minds very necessary because they were reacting against this anything goes congregational approach, you know, and so they were trying to preserve the true church by getting out away from what was becoming the accepted social, cultural expression of the church. So monasticism kind of saved the true church, if you will. Now, there were a few weird things that they did too that we briefly touched on, but that's, you know,
The guy in the tree.
the guy in the tree, the guy on the pole, you know, all that stuff.
It's always something.
Yeah. You just
Climbers.
you just have to accept them and move on from there. But monasticism was an actually helpful movement. Sometimes, you know, you think about monks and you think about these abbeys that they're at and so forth, and you think to yourself, what good are they doing? I mean, what is the point? A bunch of people out in the middle of no place, nobody ever really knows where they are, what they're doing, who they are. But they've really been an essential piece of humankind in all of the times that they existed, because they have been people who have preserved an understanding of God and sought a deeper understanding of God and influenced people for that kind of a thing and helped shape the mind of the church. And even today, they're helpful that way, because they often will be serving a local community, but at the heart of all of the monastic movements and communities is this need and desire and practice of praying for the world. And you wonder, how bad off would the world be if they weren't doing that, And so thank God for somebody whose whole life is committed to praying for the world and what God wants to do in the world. Thank you for that. So monasticism rises as a recovery and preservation of the church. Their concern is for maintaining the true church and not getting swept up in the cultural shaping of the church. And out of the monastic communities then comes this sense of scholasticism, where the church is defining what it thinks. We talked last time about the church developing this body of knowledge that it begins to present as truth in the world. And so the monastic communities begin to build on that body of knowledge with scholasticism in it, and they begin to dominate the culture because they're dominating the thought of the culture. They're the ones thinking deeply about what it means to be human people in the sight of God and in what God has done and what does God want to have done in the world. They're developing the church's mind in this time. And so we might look at this and be bored to tears with it. And believe me, there's a lot to be bored when you're reading this kind of stuff. But they were thinking deeply about what does it mean to know God. And somebody has to do that, And so thank God for those people who did that, and really then laid kind of a foundation for thought to be developed. I mean, this is what universities do today, right? They lay foundations, and to get a PhD, what do you have to do? What do you have to demonstrate to get a PhD in today's academic climate? Original research, yes. You have to develop something new. And add to the body of knowledge for whatever discipline you're in. And so it's kind of a blessing and a curse. When you go to a PhD dissertation defense, you're basically saying, I am the expert in this topic, in this field, in knowing it, and in what I'm presenting. And if you can defend it, then they say, okay, here's your piece of paper. Thank you for your money. But here's your piece of paper. And if you can't defend it, then they just say, no, we've heard this before. Sorry. Back to school. And this is actually a difference between the academic doctorate and the professional doctorate, right? Because the professional doctorate does what? It builds on the understanding of the topic in a particular field, and the academic promotes that talk and expands the field of knowledge. So this is what scholasticism is doing in this particular. It's building the field of knowledge. It's introducing this new understanding of who God is, and it helps us to see that this is a good thing. It's good. So the church is not against deep thinking. The church has always valued deep thinking. But there have been times in the church's history when they have pushed back on that, How many times did you hear, I did growing up, if you want to lose your faith, go to seminary, because seminary at that particular time was informed by a lot of very progressive liberal thought from Germany, where all the heresy comes from. So that's... So that's what was sweeping the seminary at the time. And so they thought, well, if you want to lose your faith, go to seminary because it'll just destroy what you're doing. And I always feel bad for Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a PhD, teaches at Duke University. He has a PhD in New Testament, but he lost his faith while he was doing his PhD. But when you end up with a PhD in New Testament, what do you do with that? When you're an atheist now and you don't know what to do, well, you have to teach, you have to make a living. So his basic living now is deconstructing the Christian faith from an academic standpoint to say, well, this is how Jesus became God. That's one of the titles of his books, How Jesus Became God. And so he's trying to make a living with the only thing he knows, but he doesn't have the faith, to sustain it. And he's kind of in a bad, I don't know Bart personally, I just know of Bart, and I'm thinking, what a miserable existence that must be, So, why don't you just go drive a train or something like that? If you've lost your faith, then why are you continuing? I know he's invested a lot of his life in that, but it's like, goodness sake. Anyhow, we just have to appreciate this emphasis on scholasticism because it is important for the church to think. It is important for the church to understand who it is and who God is and what that means for the life God is trying to bring us and develop in us. So we need that kind of thought. We shouldn't run away from it. A scholar that I respect once said, Jesus would be the first to tell you, if you can find something better than what I'm offering, go do it. Of course, he knew that you wouldn't, but yes.
Can you give a short definition of monasticism and scholasticism?
Monasticism is it comes from the Latin word for alone. And so the monastic people were people who went out to be by themselves in the desert. Is where it began, but it emerged into develop dedicated communities. So they were alone together, in a sense, and so there were usually small cells, but oftentimes, and we'll get to, Benedict is the guy that we'll get to help define what that really is, but it used to be pretty loosey-goosey. You just go out there and find God, so to speak. So monasticism is being alone with God and growing in that sense of perfectionism. They sought to be sanctified, more sanctified, and so forth. And scholasticism is the academic intellectual development of the church's thought. It's the thinking through. It's the intellectual side of faith. So sometimes people put this artificial head-heart thing together to say, well, okay, I can see you're they're advocating for faith of the heart. They say, well, you have faith of the head, but you don't have faith of the heart. Well, I think that's an artificial, what Amy would call false dilemma, right? And this is you don't have to separate those two things. But scholasticism was an emphasis upon developing the intellectual understanding of the faith. And so they would write long treatises, like Augustine, we talked about last week, 40,000 scripture quotations in 3 major works. And so, but they had a lot of time on their hands, It wasn't like they had to, watch the Oscars today. So scholasticism is the development of the church's mind, and that there's a good thing, but there's a bad thing to this too, because then it becomes institutional, and so the kind of boundaries begin to creep in on the church, and the church becomes less a movement and more an institution. When it was a movement, it was dynamic and it was sweeping and it was engaging the culture, and it wasn't settled. It was always active and good. Once you got an institution, then what do you got to do? Well, you got to what?
Go to school.
Yeah, go to school, but you have to maintain the institution. Yeah, you have to protect the boundaries. and so forth. So it becomes static, you know. And so instead of a movement which is going to people, the institution then does what? It brings people there. You know, you come to there, and so there's a little bit of. I mean, that's the downside of scholasticism. And the other thing is then you begin to develop this idea where you're only speaking to a certain group of people. At first, scholasticism wasn't so bad because, you know, people were pretty smart and they were talking. You know, it's an oral culture, so a lot of people retained a lot of information. I mean, they were used to remembering things, you know, and so forth. But, you know, as time goes on, our capacity for memory changes. You know, it changes with every new iteration of the phone because you would get greater memory on the phone. You have to think about it up here, you know. So it's so the common person, and we'll get to this in the Reformation. At the time of the Reformation, the Christianization of culture was so pervasive that it was said that even the butcher has conversations about whether the Father is the same as the Son and whether that is the same as the Spirit, you know. So you go to the butcher store, you get into a theological conversation, is what they're saying.
You get some level of crowd mentality in that this group has this scholastic belief, so you have segregated things that are scholastically focused on a certain area.
Yes.
So you have a lot of separation based on.
Well, that does happen as well. And so, you know, when we get to here, that's what happens. Because you have this growing divide between the Eastern Church and the Western Church in terms of what's important and what isn't important. And so, yes, that happens. And the Eastern Church has their scholars as well. Yeah, they have their own authorities, scholastic authorities, and that they refer to and so forth. So yeah, you do have this competitive kind of a thing, and we'll see how that ends up being a problem in the 11th century. Okay, so these are the major themes, and the papacy develops as an important thing because the temporal governments are weak in this time. Remember, Rome was the world empire. But by the time of the 5th century, Rome has collapsed, okay? And what's happening? Well, those nasty Germans again are coming down and sweeping through and taking care of everything. They're ransacking villages and everything like that, and they have weird beliefs.
They were called barbarians.
Barbarian, yeah. And so they were sweeping through, and people were reacting against that, and so the governments were weak. The temporal governments were weak, but the papacy was growing stronger because it was acquiring land and money, and it was beginning to be the thing that gave legitimacy to rulers. And so the rulers, the temporal rulers, kings and all that, began to seek the legitimacy of their rule by decree of the Pope. Because everyone believed the Pope had, you know, the power to do that. I mean, so that becomes then one of the roles of the Pope is to legitimate give legitimacy to the monarchy. And so this is why later on in the Reformation that becomes a problem, because then it's like, well, I mean, if we're not going to be Catholic, who's going to give legitimacy to the ruling government? You know, because the Pope's certainly not going to say, okay, it's okay if you want to believe a little bit differently there. You know, no problem. So that creates all kinds of other problems, and we'll talk more about that if we ever get there. But there are some legitimate problems that come up with that. It's kind of like, one person described the Reformation like this. It's like Luther. Luther pulls out the sock drawer and he dumps it all on the bed and says, we don't need any of this. You know. And then Calvin comes along, second generation reformer. Calvin comes along and says, okay, well, maybe we do need this and maybe this. And kind of puts order back into the sock drawer. Leaves some of the stuff out, but puts it all back together. And that's a good description of the difference between Luther and Calvin. Luther kind of blows it all up, and Calvin kind of goes, oy vey, and puts some of it back together. Because the big question was, if we're not Catholic, how do we be the church? And Calvin really didn't want to do any of this. Calvin wanted to be a different kind of a scholar. He wanted to be one of these people. And but he ends up in this pastoral role because he has to help people figure out how to be the church now that we're not Catholic, and so forth. So this is why Calvin devotes his time to all the stuff that he writes about, not because he was very interested in it, but because it was the requirement of the moment. So he was raised up at that time for that purpose, and so forth. So they take on these roles because of necessity in the moment that it was created. So, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So anyhow, the papacy becomes this important piece, and then out of the papacy come these rivalries because as the papacy gains power in Rome, that begins to cast a little bit. There's some ecclesiastical jealousy in some of the other areas that had certain geographical locations under their jurisdiction, so to speak. So there are at the time that developed, there are 8 different kind of centers, and we'll get to this in a moment. But there are different geological centers of faith kind of jurisdiction. And the Bishop of Rome is essentially part of that. But the Bishop of Rome begins to think, but I'm just a little more equal than the rest of you guys. And most of the other ones don't have enough power to push back on that, except for the guys in Constantinople who begin to say, no, we're not going to take that. We're just not going to listen to that. So, and then finally in 1054 they say, okay, we're done. And
Question.
yes.
How?
Hal.
Oh, and you can pass on this one, but doesn't the papacy go back to those verses? I think there's just a few where, Peter, Jesus says to Peter, you have the keys to the kingdom, and they kind of say, well, the reason we're who we are is because we're directly from.
Yes.
And I think, I mean, how do most people interpret that passage? I guess you could say, or I mean, is that true? Is that
If you're Catholic, that's how you interpret it.
Or on this rock I built my church.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a professor once who summed it up this way. It says, I shouldn't go there.
Because of time. Yeah, because of time.
After class talk?
It's not appropriate. It's not that it's obscene or vulgar. We're just moving on. If you're Catholic, you interpret it that way. And most other people, the Protestants have a different view of that particular passage. The keys of the kingdom are not kind of like here's the front door to the Vatican, which hasn't been built yet, but you'll love it when it comes. It's not that. It's the keys of the kingdom are what? The gospel. That's the keys of the kingdom, And so this is what the rest of the church world thinks, but the Catholics reduce it down to apostolic succession.
Right?
Yeah. So. Okay. So the papacy gains power, and that has good things and bad things, kind of like the kings of Israel. There's a few good ones, but a lot of bad ones. And the papacy begins with a good heart, and it ends in other ways. So here are some of the major figures then in this period of time, and they all contribute significant thought into the life of the church, and they give us a significant understanding. So Benedict is the first guy. He's a 5th, 6th century person 480 to 547 is his lifespan there. And he's the one after whom the Benedictine communities are named. So this is the granddaddy of the Benedictine movement of monks. So let me just kind of condense what he does. He's the guy who develops a rule for what it means to be a monk. Because prior to that, it was like, well, whatever you want to do. And sometimes the monks were kind of a cantankerous group of people, and sometimes they were a little bit, they were rascals. But it was okay because they were monks and you couldn't, So Benedict, he comes up. I mean, Benedict was invited by one group to be an abbot. They tried to poison him because they didn't like what he was saying. He survives that attempt and leaves the community. He says, I guess we're not compatible, So Benedict goes back to his cave where he thinks more about this. He comes back, but he's recognized as this deep thinker about what it means to live in community. So he establishes a number of monasteries, even though he really only wants to live in one by himself. He doesn't want to be the granddaddy of the monasteries, but they ask him, you do this so well, so why can't we do this? And so he writes a book, a simplified book, Monasteries for Dummies. And so he has this rule, and there's 73 chapters in this book of the monastic life, 73 chapters on that. And it's very highly organized. He's thought carefully about that. But it is the first systematic treatment of monastic living. It gives purpose to what they're doing and says, you guys have a reason for being here and you need to make sure that the main thing stays the main thing, And so this rule, so he establishes times for sleep and times for prayer and times for work and times for spiritual development. So if you go to any Benedictine community, they are very regulated. And they get up at like 3:30 in the morning first they get up at midnight for a service, then they're back asleep for a few hours and they come back for early morning prayers at 3:30 or 4 or something like that. Then they go back to sleep again, then they come back at 6 for prayers, and they have regular times of prayer, and that was built on a passage in Psalms where David says, 7 times a day I pause to praise you. And Benedict latched onto that and said, that's a good idea. So he established those times. So not only then did he give some shape to the day and work life of monks, but he establishes some welfare rules for how to take care of one another and all of that. But he also said that monasteries needed to be self-sufficient and self-contained. You couldn't be dependent on the culture because the culture what? Changes, And so you have to be self-sufficient. So this is why monks and those communities often are creating some commodity. Yeah, beekeepers or winemakers or beer makers or whatever, they sell goods, and that's what they thrive on. But the vows then that they take this is the first time then the vows get solidified into poverty, chastity, and obedience. And the obedience is really more a matter of perseverance. So the idea was when you became a monk, it wasn't like, okay, I've had my fun after a year and a half, I think I'm done, The obedience thing was you do this, you do it for life. That's the point. And so it was really for perseverance sake, not for anything else. And the abbot, the head monk, their rule was absolute in the community. So you have to have somebody who says the buck stops here, and so that was the abbot. So he develops this life for them. Benedict does that, and that's a good thing because it gives some shape and some sense of what does it mean to live this kind of a devoted life, and they begin to serve communities. That's what begins to come out of there is those monasteries begin to actually serve the communities that they're nearby instead of the other way around. Instead of the communities serving the monastery, they were serving the communities, and that began to be a missionary enterprise because even as the culture changed or they went to new places, people that they served didn't have to share their faith convictions. They just had to be people. And they met the needs of the people that were there, and that was a good example and a great sense of what it meant to live a devoted life. And this was also the means to sanctity, because in this kind of a setting, this is where the spiritual disciplines begin to really develop, is that when you're under the vow of obedience and perseverance, these monks are not all Mr. Rogers, There's some cantankerous fellows there, and some people that you just can't get along with sometimes, and it takes a while. But living in that kind of a community, and you're there. It's not like you're banished or he's banished. It's just this is the way it is. You have to learn to get along with that person. You have to find a way to get past whatever it is that's causing irritation, and that's a good thing. So this is Benedict's contribution. Gregory, he's a little bit later after Benedict. He's a Christian. He found 7 monasteries of his own, but his legacy is that of the papacy. He reluctantly becomes the Pope. He doesn't want to be the Pope. In fact, he is the Pope at one time, and then he resigns and walks away. And they all, like a couple of years later, say, "No, you got to come back because it's just in a shambles. You have to be the Pope." And so he's like, "Okay, I'll be the Pope, but I'm not wearing red shoes." So he comes back to be the Pope, and this is when the power of the papacy begins to really develop, because he's the one who kind of institutes the legitimacy of monarchy. But the papacy under Gregory becomes responsible for the welfare of the people, and instead of building its own thing. So I mean, he's establishing the papacy as an institution, but he's also very concerned about the welfare of the people that he serves, and he becomes, like Francis today, trying in various ways around the world. Gregory is the first church leader who tries to broker peace with the invaders that are coming into the area. So he becomes an instrumental prince of peace, if you will, in that time. So his legacy, you probably know it, even though you don't. One of them is this contribution to liturgy. Liturgy is the work of the people. Okay? And so what was the work of the people during worship? Singing. So, but a lot of the singing was not accessible to the people because they didn't sing very well. So Gregory introduced the chant. Yeah, which is just like a few notes up and down. Yeah, the Gregorian chant. It's just a few notes up and down. And people are like, "Oh, we can do that," And so that actually catches on, and people begin to do that and participate in worship, and it makes it accessible to all the people. So it's actually quite interesting to listen to for a short period of time. I mean, it's lovely for a time, but I couldn't do it all the time. But there are monasteries that do it all the time. He was also the one who developed an early edition of the lectionary. So where does the lectionary come from? It comes from Gregory. And he was the one who set it up on a 3-year cycle, the prescribed readings for the church year, so that you could get through the major understanding of what the scriptures had to say about God and about us and about the world and about what God wanted to happen. So you begin to hear the Word of God on a regular thing. Gregory is also one who published a book on pastoral care, ministerial practice. Here's how you are the pastor of a local community. They didn't have one of those before. You couldn't go down to the bookstore and find the book of order for, the Catholic Church at that time. So they had to have a rule book for how do you do this. He develops that. So Calvin, as a matter of fact, high praise from Calvin, says he is the last of the good popes. Calvin has nothing good to say about popes after that, but he is a big fan of Gregory. So.
Did the calendar, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. There's a lot that these people were raised up for a particular moment in time. They had the gifts, they had the opportunities, they had the skills, and they went. So.
Is he the one you mentioned earlier, the patron saint for the Eastern Orthodox Church too?
He may be, yeah, because he's equally revered in both the Eastern and the Western Church. Yeah. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, and we need more than a few minutes to talk about Charlemagne. Although really, all you should probably end up remembering about Charlemagne is that he was a conqueror who was legitimized by the Pope and came through and converted people at the point of a sword. So he'd approach a village and say, "Would you like to all be Christian or die?" And they said, "But can we think about it?" And he said, "We'll be back in 2 days and get your answer." So the villages would come together and think about it and talk about it. And so he'd come back 2 days later and they said, "We think we'll probably become Christian," So, yes.
Earlier you used the phrase, when you had the councils, that they were deciding what they would die for.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't seem like there's a very far distance between what you would die for and what you would kill for.
Yes. It's a good observation on that, because it quickly moved the papacy as it grows in power. It becomes thirsty for control, and so as it's acquiring assets and structure, then it raises. Actually, Charlemagne is a pawn of the papacy in that moment, because they establish him as the ruler of the what? Do you know what it? The Holy Roller. That's a little bit later, 1922. At the Holy Roller Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, which is the papacy's idea of what a good thing should be. But they don't pay a whole lot of attention to those convictions that they came to earlier on. They kind of begin to lose the foundation of there, because as the church becomes equivalent to the state, then you become a citizen of the church as soon as you're born. And so people grow up as saved people, but without knowing why or anything of that nature. And so there is greater distance between the true faith that the Pope was supposed to maintain and what Jesus actually wanted to see happen in the church. Even Constantine, way back before all of this, Constantine was not a fervent believer per se. Constantine had a vision of the cross at the beginning of this crusade when he came in to invade, and because he won, he saw that as the approval of God, in that, and so he becomes a Christian because God saved him in that moment. But for instance, at that council that he called, he wasn't really interested in theological purity. He was just really interested in peace. He just didn't want them to continue warring. And that's kind of the way it has always been as the papacy gained power. It wasn't so much about doctrinal purity It was more about who do we control? How much of the world do we control? So here in scholasticism, they sought to shape the culture to a more Christian understanding, to an understanding of what is God after in the world. And the papacy was more about we want to hang on to power. And so these eventually became opponents in that until later times, Thomas Aquinas shows up, and they can't refute what he writes. But yes, it's a good point. That's why this is a pretty rough and tumble era, because they make one claim here, but they act this way otherwise. And that happens today too, doesn't it? I mean, it does. It still happens. Did that address your topic, your question?
Yeah, I have another question, but I don't think we have time.
Because you have 30 seconds.
See,
Did you have a question?
I'll ask next week.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure. You're welcome. Okay, let's pick up with Charlemagne and move on from there.